a study we did later, actually, as a follow-up, was looking at monozygous twins. So this is actually interesting, being a scientist. This is a classic example of one of my graduate students who had been in my lab for probably 3 or 4 years. And she was in our single fiber physiology lab, and you imagine she's isolating individual muscle fibers from an athlete, one by one with the tweezer. And she's going to do several thousand individual cells, right? So you're down there for hours, and things happen down there. You kind of lose your mind. And she was just kind of going on one day with one of my colleagues and just talking, and she's like, oh yeah, my uncle is really, really fit and something or other. And then, oh yeah, he's a twin. And it was like, oh, is he monozygous? And she's like, yeah.
For those that don't know, monozygous are identical twins.
Yeah, which is interesting. So you basically have, what I'm setting up here is this is the perfect exercise scientific experiment. Monozygous identical twins mean they have the exact same DNA. So an egg was fertilized, split, and then 2 humans grew out of that with the exact same DNA. And so now we can start answering the question, well, yeah, okay, what about maybe these cross-country skiers? Maybe they were just genetic freaks. Maybe it didn't matter. It's like some people have, well, genetics are always a component to it, but how much? Well, now we have a scenario lining up where it's like, wait a minute, you have monozygous twins. So we have a replica of a human being, exact same DNA. The only differences that we would see in their physiology now would be due to lifestyle circumstances. Interesting. So monozygous twin, a dad and uncle, right? Great. Do they exercise? Well, one of them does. He's a lifelong endurance exercise. Runner, cyclist, swimmer, Ironman, all these things. What about the other one? Nope, he doesn't exercise at all. And at that point, like, I wanted to kill my graduate student because I'm like, you've been in my lab for 3 years or more probably, and you've never told me that in your household is the perfect scientific experiment for exercise you could ever create. And like, she's just, the look on her face when my colleague and I were staring at her, she's just like, oh my God. So I'm like, call them right now. They're coming in the lab. We'll fly them in from Chicago. I don't care what we have to do. Like, we're getting them in. And so I wanted to actually, going back to the model that was first developed by the Harvard Fatigue Lab, one thing that's interesting about that community is they started off with the concept of trying to examine human performance through a holistic lens. And so it was the antithesis of looking at either organ by organ. So we're going to only look at the cardiovascular system. We're only going to look at skeletal muscle. And then we're saying we're looking at this entire picture. And so that model we wanted to carry through in these twins. And I said, all right, I want to bring them in the lab, but I'm not just going to look at one system. I want to do everything. So we took stool samples, we took blood, we did vertical jump tests, we did maximum strength tests, we did MRIs of muscle mass, we did VO2 max tests, we did efficiency stuff, we did genetic testing, we did an IQ test, we did psychological battery. We wanted to look at everything to figure out, of these things, what differ between the twins. And if so, the second key question there is, by how much? So can I improve my VO2 max? Sure, everyone knows that, but how much? Can it change by 5%, 80%? Like, where's the number? And so putting some quantification on this was very important. And so, again, we had another example of a classic endurance-only training paradigm compared to a non. So this is a person who's, I think, he's a truck driver by vocation, which is, I think he actually drove for a potato chip company, which was even funnier. The endurance athlete actually was great because, like any endurance people, he had physical books of all of his training mileage for the last 35 years. And we just went through them. And we calculated the total amount of miles he ran, his averages, his heart rates per time. We had this unbelievable thing, like what races he was in. He had the documentation. It was just totally nuts, right? Like something that endurance people are like shaking their head right now going, oh yeah, I got that too. And everyone else
endurance
is like,
folks are pretty nerdy.
Yeah, they're super nerdy, right? So it was great because now we could validate as close as one could to actually how much he ran and things like that. So they had about a 35-year discord. They both exercised up through high school. About 18, they stopped doing it. And by the time they brought them in the lab, they're in their mid-50s. So it was about 35 years of difference. And when we ran them through the testing, if you look at the measures that were similar to the Sweden study, it was almost identical. The exercising twin was significantly better at things like a lipid panel, resting heart rate, blood pressure, VO2 max. Any of those markers, as predicted, were much better. What was very interesting, though, was the things that were in the middle. First of all, their total amount of muscle mass was almost identical, like to the gram, within the margin of error of a DEXA scan could possibly ever be. The non-exerciser, though, was a little bit fatter. So the difference in actual body weight was explained almost entirely by body fat. or non-lean tissue, really. Same sort of deal. So, okay, like no one's surprised there that the exerciser was a little bit leaner, even though it didn't change total amount of muscle mass at all. When we looked at some of the more functional tests, and we looked at things like muscle quality. So this is a metric you can get from an ultrasound. You can kind of think about this as how much fat is inside the tissue, which is sometimes an advantage for an endurance athlete to have a little bit more of what are called intramuscular triglycerides because it's a fuel directly in the tissue. But in general, the exercise or the muscle quality was not in favor of the exerciser. If you looked at the performance testing and if you looked at strength, it favored the non-exerciser. And so now again, we have the same finding we saw in our Sweden study, but in identical twins. And so it really, really highlighted the fact that if you want to move forward with optimal health, simply picking one silo is not going to get you there.
One silo meaning just running, just cycling.
Right.
Does this mean that the twin that did not exercise could jump higher or win an arm wrestling competition? Not that that's a vital thing to be able to do, but just in terms of measuring strength, sort of isometric strength, was the non-exercising twin stronger or at least as strong as their exercising twin?
Yes, particularly in grip strength. Yep. And any of the measures like the vertical jump, leg extension power, and a number of things, they often favored the non-exerciser, which you're still a little bit of a chicken and egg. You don't know if necessarily the endurance training reduced that other twin's strength, or it doesn't even really matter per se. I think the highlight of it is, can you change some of these metrics of VO2 max? Yeah, not even close. These things are very responsive regardless of your genetics. Your genetics will give you a starting place very clearly. Even the non-exerciser was a pretty healthy guy. So they were in a good spot. He's mid-50s, doesn't exercise, doesn't really pay attention to his diet at all, and he was in a pretty good shape. However, if you want to actually move progress and move forward high functionality, you have to do something besides just run, right? Just distance run. Now, I could say the same thing for strength training. That alone, because I don't want to make this seem like I'm saying endurance exercises, it worked. In both these studies, those folks were much better off in metrics that are incredibly important to mortality, how long you're going to live, VO2 max, et cetera.